Welcome everyone to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissel, and tonight we are continuing our deep dive series into the Bermuda Triangle. This is part 38 today. I hope you're all doing well. Please make sure to hit the like button. We are beginning our show shortly. We'll be reading today from the Bermuda Triangle II by Gian J. Quasar. We are on chapter 9. And let's see the title page real quick. Beyond Forgotten Tides is today's chapter. So get your drink ready, get your snacks. We'll be getting into this pretty thoroughly tonight. Anyways, I hope you've all had a great week. We had a great show on Tuesday with our Coral Castle deep dive series. We are on part 40 of that right now. I suggest you go check it out if you haven't yet. Hey, John, good to see you here. We got John in the chat. This is going to be a good show. So, as with most of this content, we tend to tread over things several times every now and then. But I think it's important because we come back to these big mysteries that we still are trying to piece all of this together with. So, thank you for being here through all of this. And if you're new to this series, please give it a shot. Start from the beginning. See how you like it. It's a little rudimentary at first compared to the production that we have going today with the intros and everything. But I really do appreciate all of your viewership and support. So, if you do want to support my channel further, since YouTube seems to have this channel on a blacklist, we're hitting ceilings of 100 views on a lot of these live streams, and we shouldn't be. That's less than 0.5% of our entire viewership, or less than 10%, I guess. I'd say like 5%. But anyways, it's very, very small in numbers compared to where it should be. And this channel used to get thousands, tens of thousands of views. I have a few videos that are hundreds of thousands of views. So this is where we're at now, but I am continuing to put the content out. Half of the struggle is to just show up, and here I am. So we do have 8 slides from this chapter, and as we carry on with the reading, as we approach these different inserts in the book, I will have them available on the screen. And for those that are tuning in that are visually impaired, I will describe to the best of my ability what I'm showing on screen from the book. So I appreciate everybody that's here. You guys that come into the comments after these shows, and I had one user tell me that they're visually impaired, so they've been looking forward to reading these books, and apparently there's really no audiobook available for this content. So I was thinking about this a few months ago, and I have yet to execute it, but I do want to make this available as audio only on several podcasting sites. So that'll be a project that'll be ongoing, and those podcasts will most likely have a lot of dead air cut out from these lives here, but it's something I just want to try to help expand the reach so that the people that are seeking this type of content out, they're able to find it. But anyways, let's go. Let's get started. Enough of me talking here. In the meantime, while we are waiting for the selections in the book to be shown on screen, I will put the Illuminati up on here. And again, we're going to be covering portions in this chapter where the Illuminati has discovered several things, including roadways that are on the bottom of the ocean around the Bermuda Triangle. So let's begin. Chapter 9, Beyond Forgotten Time. It would be so shocking as to render the discoverer incapable of speech if at a newly discovered ancient archaeological site, having excavated through the buried city's successive layers of habitation, from the present dirt level, through the debris layers, through successive layers marking its decline, its golden epoch, the Bronze Age, and through the layers wherein was contained the developing city, testified by artifacts of crude stick idols, of burnt clay, and ungainly utilitarian pottery, to then dig below this and discover a jet airplane. Yet, in many aspects, the march of civilization on this planet intimately reflects this same paradox, only that it is contained in such a broad scope, it has remained largely invisible until the last century. Even civilizations we assess as being crowning achievements in the march of mankind's progress, like Greece and Rome, seem anemic compared to the mysterious ambition contained in the first monuments of mankind. Going back into ancient Egyptian history for comparison brings forward the sense that progress was at one point compromised, almost in the vein we consider mass production today to have compromised the artistic and philosophic expressions of our own civilization. The late and even middle periods of Egypt pale by comparison to the early kingdom, some 2,500 years before Christ, when such epic feats of engineering as the Great Pyramids were dared and accomplished. So I would just like to comment on Egypt. We do know that these pharaohs, when they started off, they were very extravagant. The buildings they had, the hieroglyphics that they left behind. But after each succeeding pharaoh, the following pharaoh would go in and carve over the previous pharaoh's hieroglyphs. And that's where we have a decline in ancient Egypt history. So we've actually lost a lot due to the succeeding pharaohs as time went on. And it's just unfortunate. That's the reality of it. They kept reusing what the first dynasties had. Maybe they had lost the technology then, and they were just trying to reuse what they already had. There's even the concept that the Great Pyramids of Giza were there well before any of our documented history of ancient Egypt civilization. Meaning, that civilization may have just found the pyramids out in the desert and claimed them as their own. There's this whole thing going around with lost history about buildings being founded aka being found and not built or constructed or erected. So that's an interesting note to keep in mind. But let's continue reading here. Even older than these are the temples or observatories made of blocks of stone, fantastic in size. They continue to inspire and dazzle modern man not just by their size and astronomical precision, but by the fact that they represent a kind of collective ambition we seem to have lost, but which seems spiritually to dominate the character of the earliest civilized men, if we are to judge them solely by the stupendous monuments they have left behind. This assessment is not utterly misplaced on our part, for their monuments are so massive as to have earned them the classification of Cyclopean, recalling the giant Cyclops of Greek mythology and reflecting our impression only giants could move such huge stone blocks. And we cover a lot of that material in our Tuesday shows with Coral Castle, with how exactly do they move those giant blocks. Use of individual and collectively placed mammoth stone blocks was an art or science long forgotten even by the Hellenistic age, though the use of such enormous monoliths alone dominated the architecture of the earliest and in many cases still unidentified civilizations. Instead of trying to explain them, the ancient Greeks attributed these constructions to a time of heroes and demigods. Such an attitude is hardly that of an ancient people impressed by something they could not reproduce. It is an attitude many share today. This is not to say that these mysterious cultures, or to be possibly more accurate, science displayed the intricate engineering knowledge of the Greeks. It is that their desire was for grandeur, and they collectively could bring it about without building on the acquired knowledge of previous civilizations. It is true what Sir Isaac Newton said when assessing his own accomplishments, quote, "I stand on the shoulder of giants," end quote. But for the earliest civilizations of mankind, we have certainly found none before our own prehistory upon whose shoulders they could have balanced themselves. They did not hew stones to perfection, this is true. Yet they did not shy from selecting the largest natural stones of their desire, sometimes weighing hundreds of tons, then equally unknown to us, move the blocks, erect them, and then chisel fine joins to seal them together. If their technology was lacking, their ambition was not. So I'm unsure here about this with the monetization for the show today. I'm going to turn off all ads going forward for the rest of today's show. I did this on Tuesday as well, so we'll see how that works. The goal is audience retention here with removing the ads. So I know you guys were having problems with it displaying too many of them, so I'm just taking them off the live here. Despite our great science, we are nevertheless a techno-intricate society. In many ways, like the Hellenistic age was an optically intricate society. Its engineering dependent on minute and precise physical beauty. Both of our societies, however, reflect no ability or mental disposition for the grandeur of physical marvels which so permeate the earliest civilizations. Neither the Greeks nor we today can move such enormous blocks that weigh hundreds of tons, and yet such monuments and fortifications, and in parentheses, for lack of any other readily apparent interpretation, end parentheses, still exist from a time we classify as prehistory, or certainly the earliest time of our own parent civilizations in Sumeria around 3100 BC, a mere 5,000 years ago. It is the collective ambition, the almost megalomania, that seemed to be natural and undaunted in this first mysterious culture in remote antiquity, that is as fascinating to contemplate as much, if not more than, the stupendous edifices that were the result of it. A trait we admire or marvel at because we seem to have lost it for our shrunken world of mass production and convenience, or worse, because of our shrunken mindset. Another paradox is encountered in any assessment of the westward march of European civilization. Mass migrations of ancient mankind in their tribes can be gauged from the vantage point of our Greco-Roman background as coming from the east. The Indo-European peoples spread out from some central point north of the Middle East and pour into Europe in various waves, occupying the most temperate areas around the Mediterranean. This continued for millennia, with the latter migrations of the Celts underscoring the paradox the most. The Celts do not seem to be firmly in place in Europe until 500 BC, a time considerably after the golden age of the Mycenaean and Minoans cultures, and a time already after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians. They came to dominate Western Europe from modern-day Austria, Switzerland, France, and into Spain and the British Isles. Paradoxically, however, in their westward expansion, they came across the huge monoliths of Karnak, France, and then across the Channel in Britain, the mysterious site of Stonehenge. Modern archaeology has confirmed that Stonehenge and the monoliths of Brittany were in place around the time of the Great Pyramids, or around 2500 BC, long before the Celts, and may have replaced an earlier wood construction that dated to prehistory, one that reflected considerable science of astronomy. For any westward moving people before or during the Indo-European migration to continue moving westward through to open land, to then encounter at the western extremes of Europe the astounding megalithic sites, is like the analogy of a modern archaeologist digging to the lowest layer of a city's habitation to discover not the most primitive artifacts, but those that seem superior even to our own civilization today. Unlike the analogy, however, the westward drive of mankind and the discovery of the megalithic but mysterious culture on the fringes of the Atlantic is fact and not fantasy. To assume the megalithic builders had immigrated from the east, like the other Indo-Europeans, is to propose they passed a the choice lands of Europe to live on the farthest reaches of the known world. There to build stone structures that still matched in magnificence, if not in specific style, those of earliest civilizations far removed from France and Britain, but which also used Cyclopean stones. The dating of megalithic culture, as it is called, is also peaking because its coincidence is with that early ambitious time in the cultures with which we are familiar, such as Egypt. In fact, it seems the further west civilization traveled, the more it adopted the use of mastering heavy loads and stone blocks, something seen in Egyptian pyramids, but not in Sumerian fired clay ziggurats to the east. From our Judeo-Christian perspective, this does not fit. And again, I don't agree with that term Judeo-Christian. It's an oxymoron. All mankind spread out after the flood from some central location around Ararat, and that's spelled A-R-A-R-A-T, the location from which even the European grapevine originates. Civilization then began in Mesopotamia, along the two major rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. Here, mankind built huge cities of mud brick. Westward and eastward movement of civilization from Mesopotamia, or north thereof, is so evident from our perspective, it is taken for granted, each pocket of it arising around major rivers like the Nile, Indus, or in the Mediterranean, on significant islands or advantageous Yissilmissil, as in France, each preserving legends of a past golden age, and each equally recalling a past global destruction out of which they emerged. Judging from the migration pattern, we always assumed this parent civilization was somewhere in the Middle East. The fabled Babel, which in legend thinly preserved the destruction of some one language, cohesive and yet vast civilization. Yet it is the furthest from legendary Babel, in the most outlying edifices in the West, where the buildings were composed of stupendous-sized stones. From an engineering perspective, it is actually much more accomplished to build in small stone than in monoliths. But these megalithic structures still fit the theory that these civilizations were built by survivors of an early advanced super civilization that was destroyed. The builders of Cyclopean edifices did not have the engineering skills of Mesopotamia, but they still had the desire or need to erect huge monuments, and seem to have done so with what abilities they had. Even more interesting is the possibility that the Gigantea on Malta, and Gigantea is spelled G-I-G-A-N-T-I-G or I-J-A. So again, G-I-G-A-N-T-I-J-A on Malta, considerably further west than Egypt, is actually the first freestanding stone building. It is too circular like Stonehenge, or it too is circular like Stonehenge, which is not a feature of Egyptian architecture, and made of huge megalithic blocks. I want to check this out real quick. So we're going to show a few of these photographs up here. These are not from the book. I'm doing a quick search on the internet here. Yeah, these are some giant stones. Alright, give me a moment here and I will explain what we're looking at. Okay. So I just pulled up some recent photographs of the Gigantea. And they said it stands circular. Let me see here. So there's large pieces of stones that make up this location. There's a lot of smaller stones as it gets higher up. And inside, it looks like on the inside there's smaller stones as well. Some of it looks like that coral rock. But there's definitely pathways, doorways. We're seeing a lot of different things here. And of course, there's modern like catwalks for tourists to walk through the remains here. There are also a few artifacts of what looked like people. Just people sitting down looking up toward the sky. And then there's also a museum, so I guess that statue was from the museum here. There's really, I want to say like half-foot statues of people, and then there's also just heads, stone heads. That's all that's left for some of these. So again, it brings back the question, what destroyed these civilizations? This actually looks like what Adelaide Skolnick did with Coral Castle, except he has a hole that's looking up to the North Star. This looks more like a channel for possibly water, but we don't know exactly what this was all used for. But yeah, this rock, it looks very porous, like it was sponged before. Very similar to Coral Castle. Ed said that he knew what these ancient civilizations did as far as moving blocks of stone, so I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if he implemented anything from here or the other 3 megalith civilizations that he points out. The Pyramids of Giza, Easter Island, Stonehenge. So the inside of this megalithic structure, there's a lot of smaller stones, as I said before. It looks like all lined up against the walls. These might not have even been here at the time when it was active. Massive archways for, it looks like a doorway here. Just imagine 2 pillars and then a topper stone over the pillars, but these pillars are very long lengthwise, so you could like walk through them. It's like a tunnel. And here's a nice overhead shot. Almost looks like a gutted out stadium, like triple stadiums, all gutted out, no roofs. There's actually like a 4th one on the smaller side on the right here. But you'd have to think like this was an impressive structure when it was active. And I really won't put aside that this might have had gigantic stone carvings of humanoid people as well, such as Egypt has. And there's so much that we don't know. It's just a shame. So this is Gigantia on Malta. And it's considerably further west than Egypt, is actually the first freestanding stone building. So meaning that there's really nothing supporting the walls or anything other than its own weight. There's no framing like we use today. They have massive stones on the outside, topped with smaller stones. Then you have stones that are like doorways on the inside. Again, topped with smaller stones. I mean, a lot of this could have been recovery effort after whatever catastrophic event happened. There's huge stones just like balanced on 3 pillars. It's kind of wild to look at. Oh, this is from Scotland. So we're looking at several photos here on the stream. The stone circles thing is another interesting topic to get into. Michael Tellinger is actually a good person to research on that. Tellinger. Michael Tellinger. And he researched stone circles in Africa, how they're all over the place. So it was an ancient civilization over there that has gotten buried. These are all in open grass fields now. You can see in aerial shots that there's circles. And you go down investigate on the ground, and you see that they're actually stone circles. It's not just a random formation or burial mound. Like, these things were made of stone. Who knows what they were used for. But anyways, let's continue reading here. So it too is circular like Stonehenge, which is not a feature of Egyptian architecture, and made of huge megalithic blocks. The distinguished professor of archaeology at Cambridge University, Colin Renfrew, last name spelled Renfrew, notes the paradox when he observed that, quote, in the Near East, at about this time, 3000 BC, and perhaps even earlier, the mud brick temples of the proto-literate period of Sumerian civilization were evolving. Impressive monuments in themselves, but something very different from the Maltese structures. End quote. Megalithic sites and the mysterious culture that built them remained an oddity, and their builders distorted by fancy mythologies until within the last 500 years, when the mystery grew more complex than the myths. With the discovery of the civilizations of the New World, the same paradoxical progression was uncovered. As stupendous as Mayan, Toltec, and Aztec cultures were, and those societies upon which they themselves had built, the oldest civilization in the Andes, which preceded them, all show a preoccupation with and ability to move huge stones and make organized cities from scratch that are pre-designed to accommodate tens of thousands of inhabitants. The ability to do this is even more mysterious at Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, because the air is so thin, the usual explanation of mass labor to move the megaliths seems to evidently fall short. Yeah, they'd all be out of breath after a certain time. There is also a strange similarity in many of the artifacts in the abandoned megalithic sites. On both sides of the Atlantic, that is seen most clearly in the megalithic sites of Britain and France, and in, quote, medicine wheels, end quote, in North America. It seems as if, at one time in the remote past, some cohesive civilization occupied some area around the Atlantic and was dispersed, elements gaining a foothold on the western approaches to Europe, with perhaps a smaller group accessing and influencing the westward pinnacle of Middle East civilization in Egypt with stone cutting and moving technology, where it was then modified to conform to the neat symmetry of mud brick architecture, only on a grander scale. Another retreating down the isthmus to the high Andean plains, and others, those compromising the less technological, influencing the North American cultures with similar henges as Stonehenge in Britain, but not possessing the technology to take it to megalithic stones. Though their wood henges reflect a similar knowledge of astronomy left over from the civilization of the past. Legends and even glyphs of the Maya speak of a great destruction in the east. In other words, across the Gulf of Mexico. And the glyphs depict volcanoes erupting, buildings tumbling into the sea, and survivors escaping in canoes. So this is from the Mayans. And we all know that our calendars have been adjusted in the past. So the whole 2012 Mayan calendar ending, that might not have ended yet if we're not in the current year that we're being told. So just a thought on that. Naturally, all of the above conjures legends of Atlantis, devotees of which remind us that ATL is a common word in Amerindian linguistics, and that a variation of it even means, quote, water, end quote, thus drawing a thin connecting strand between old and new world knowledge of such a civilization. Despite the concept of Atlantis being fringed with paranormal crystal power today, it is nevertheless a fact that there appears to have been an Atlantean civilization. Otherwise, it is hard to explain the similarities in the various megalithic sites around the Atlantic and their distinct difference with Sumer and Egypt. Their builders mastered and hauled stones we ourselves cannot transport, and they did so in ways of which we cannot be entirely sure. And we're trying to figure that out on Tuesday's shows. And even if our concepts of their crude wooden sleighs and use of river passage is correct, none of this explains their ambitious mindset, one that required massive cyclopean architecture and the cohesion of an entire populous state. Between the two extremes of megalithic sites those in Western Europe and those in America, are the seas of the Bermuda Triangle, where the Bahama Banks have sparked interest in the lost continent or island of Atlantis, or remnants thereof, since they are the only large, shallow banks in the world that could represent huge islands if the water table of the Atlantic was only 50 feet below its current level. And I'd like to comment here that if this is true, that there was a flooding and it wasn't from above, if it was from below, like if the ground cracked and water geysered out and filled these oceans with more water, that would explain a lot here. And that would also confirm what I was speculating about a few weeks ago, probably a few months ago now, that we might have a great reverse crack. So like these fault lines, if they did open up and geyser out water, then it could also do the opposite, where these fault lines open up and water is drained from the ocean. And then that's when these ancient civilizations all around the Bermuda Triangle will come to surface, and we will see the remnants of what's left, if there's anything left standing, which there probably is. And then it'll just be a matter of who gets there first to document it or destroy it. Let's hope that the people that appreciate accuracy in history will go there and research that if the time ever comes. So I'm also open to this idea that the Great Flood may not have come down from the skies, but it may have come from below. And that major catastrophe can, like, you know, as above, so below, the positive, negative, the yin yang. If it could have a big push up of water, it could have a big pull down and extraction of water from the oceans. So I'm thinking that's what's going to happen in probably not the near future, but at some point in the future, a draining of the oceans. Doesn't have to be more than 100 feet, and you'll see everything that's been submerged just barely under the surface around the Bermuda Triangle. All right, let's get back to reading here. Plato, of course, exaggerated Athens' glory. Indeed, simply added it to the tale. But his tale of Atlantis is his Timaeus. But his tale of Atlantis in his Timaeus, and Timaeus is spelled Timaeus, in his Timaeus dialogue, reflects that pieces of it came from many sources, some which outright knew of the American continent, and that large islands were situated before it. Since Egypt was the custodian of ancient knowledge, in parentheses, it says in Platonic Greeks' eyes, end parentheses. To give his story credibility, Plato's tale is told by an Egyptian priest to Solon. Solon is spelled Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece. The glory of Athens is declared. Then the rapine arrival and unprovoked attack by the Atlanteans into all the cultures of the Mediterranean, and in parentheses and quotes, it says Asia and Europe, end quotes and parentheses. And there's a little excerpt here, I believe, from Plato's Timaeus. So we'll read that. This power came from the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits you call the Pillars of Hercules. And in brackets it says the Straits of Gibraltar. End brackets. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together. That's a huge island. And was the way to other islands. And from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent which surrounded the true ocean. For the sea which is within the Straits of Hercules is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but the other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. And that's the end of the excerpt from Plato. There is little reason to read Plato literally, however sincere the philosopher may have been. Many who favor a more literal translation of the epic wish to believe that perhaps the mid-Atlantic ridge, of which the Azores are merely mountain tops, was once much higher, or the ocean levels much lower, as it would be before the ending of the last glaciation 12,000 years ago. Yet surroundings prove there never was an island so large in front of the Atlantic side of the Straits of Hercules, but then puny Athens was never in a position to put down such a large-scale invasion into Europe and Asia. Taking the tale as an embroidered composite, a literal substitute for Atlantis, for the island at least, can be found not in mid-Atlantic but in the Bahamas. The descriptions of the Atlantic found in the tale much more believably describe the Bahama Banks, when they were huge islands, and considering their position they were and remain, quote, the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, end quote. And I just want to give a comment here about the Florida Keys, and that if you were to lower the ocean, the ocean level by like 50 feet, you'd have a lot of highly visible islands with a lot of landmass there. And as of right now, the Florida Keys have a lot of islands, but they're very small. And modern technology, we've built a roadway that goes and travels through a portion of the Florida Keys, and then you have to visit each island by boat after that, of course. But if we were to drop the ocean level, the Florida Keys would look so different. Florida might actually grow a bit, if you think about it. And I really wonder what's in the marshlands there, in the Everglades. Hey, Larny, good to see you here. Thanks for saying hi in the chat. I appreciate it. All right, let's continue reading. By a strange twist of fate, the idea that the Bahamas represented a major portion of Atlantis, though it was an Atlantis that was in a remarkably different vein than our Platonic traditions, was first proposed in occult circles starting in the 1930s due to the psychic, quote, readings, end quote, of clairvoyant Edgar Casey, who through his many trance readings constantly spoke of Atlantis as a past super civilization and, surprisingly, that the Bahama Banks represented the last part of it to sink and take with its fabled technology, which included mind power, crystal generated levitation. Hold on a second here. And we've covered the idea of crystals being part of Atlantis. Lerny says, more Florida sounds like a disaster. Nah, not quite. Not quite. I mean, we're talking about ancient Florida here. In fact, I would say the Gulf of Mexico, if we were to lose 50 to 100 feet of ocean level, we would find so many ancient civilizations just in that little pond, if you want to call it that. Might actually turn into a pond if we lost that much ocean level. But yeah, the Florida Keys, there's something that I really don't hear talked about much at all. But there's a lot of land that's submerged that's in Florida. That was probably part of all of this ancient civilization. You gotta imagine these super civilizations were probably worldwide. When we consider that we have Roman architecture both in North America and in Europe. And with a lot of these other channels that look into architecture in the United States, there's so many Capitol buildings that it's like some of the earliest photographs we have of these capitals, they're just surrounded by dirt roads, and like the buildings don't match the settings. So we really wonder what the origin of these buildings are. It's like everybody died and then a new crop of people came in and reclaimed it. That's really what it looks like to me. Okay, getting back to the reading here. I have to restart this because this is all one sentence. By a strange twist of fate, the idea that the Bahamas represented a major portion of Atlantis, though it was an Atlantis that was in a remarkably different vein than our Platonic traditions, was first proposed in occult circles starting in the 1930s due to psychic readings of clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, who through his many trance readings consistently spoke of Atlantis as a past super civilization, and surprisingly, that the Bahama Banks represented the last part of it to sink and take with it fabled technology which included mind power, crystal-generated levitation, and even the ability to transport ships in the sea, under the sea, and then into the air. He called the banks Poseidia, and that's spelled Poseidia, and said it sank about 12,000 years ago, and there ended the last intact portion of this past super civilization, except for the remains built by its survivors on both sides of the Atlantic. Over successive generations and attacks by our more primitive ancestors, The remnants of this civilization finally had its light extinguished. Eventually, the Atlanteans being bred into us. So I just want to mention again here, Lerny, since you don't like the idea of there being more Florida, really take out today's context for everything. I know there's stories of Florida man does crazy stuff. It's all, like, all over the place. Like, people are a little loopy in Florida, but I also have family that live there that are not loopy. So it's a mixed bag of a place, really. Northern Florida is significantly different than southern Florida. And what we're talking about is southern Florida with the ancient civilizations being around there. But I'm sure it went well into the upper Midwest. I mean, you got to keep in mind the Mississippi River and the whole coast of the United States on the east side, the East Coast. Like, all of that is very ancient. And I really hope that our ancestors didn't destroy a lot of what's there, but they sure did keep secrets of what was here before they got here. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Western expansionists posts 1870s, they were traveling out west, they were blowing stuff up with dynamite left and right, looking for gold, and possibly to destroy whatever evidence was left of a past civilization over there. I'm sure all of those elements come into play. But let's get back to reading. While the psychic readings of Edgar Cayce are of more interest to the occult, and even to those who try and blame the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle on latent forces of Atlantis, now buried beneath the sea, the possibility of a buried and tangibly accessible past civilization is of more interest to archaeologists, adventurers, explorers, and to the observer, such as us. We're just observing right now, right? But we're also exploring. We're on an adventure. Alright, it is time for the slides from the book here. Got our first one. So this is an overhead map etching with a subtitle saying, "The Great and Little Bahama Banks would form two huge islands if the Atlantic was shallower by only 50 feet. They are surrounded by deep submarine gorges." So what we're looking at on screen, we're seeing the southern tip of Florida with a, it's almost like a hook of islands, which is the Florida Keys. Then we have the Quasar Bank, which sits between the Florida Keys and the Great Bahama Bank. And then south of that is Cuba. Yeah, all of this looks like it's been flooded out. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if all of that connected into the landmass of Florida if you dropped 50 feet. Cuba would be a part of Florida. Great Bahama Bank would probably be all land. Just sandy because of the ocean being as high as it is for so long. And then the Little Bahama Bank is just north of the Great Bahama Bank. And it is to the right of the southern tip of Florida. Alright, continue on reading. I'll leave this up here until we get to the next slide here. Since the details of the Caycean Atlantean theory can be found published within Into the Bermuda Triangle, and we've read that book, that's the book previous to this one. They do not need to be repeated here. A few things need to be underscored, however, before we can proceed with more recent and more tangible discoveries in the triangle. For it is certainly true that Plato's Atlantis must have come from a variety of sources, and it is equally true that some of them knew of America. Thus, thinly the Bahama Banks may hold the remains of a civilization that helped inspire the tale. Told perhaps to Phoenicians by Amerindians, who then brought it back to the Mediterranean. Its destruction and the stories they brought back may constitute the kernel of truth behind Atlantis. An intriguing report in 62 BC by Roman consul Metellus Celer, and this is spelled Metellus for first name, second name Celer. So Roman consul Metellus Celer, of what appears to be Amerindians washed ashore in Spain in a large canoe, may be only one record of many cases where Amerindians were cast upon Europe. Yet another possible avenue by which the story was brought to the Americas by seagoing early Americans. In any case, the stories of a sunken island may go back to a time when the banks were themselves huge islands before they were swamped by the Atlantic's rising levels. In other words, to a time of prehistory. The idea that there is more in the Bahamas than psychic myth gained credence on Labor Day 1968 when Dr. J. Manson Valentine discovered what is now called the, quote, Bimini Road, end quote, off the small island of Bimini in the Bahamas. It is a huge 1,200-foot long road-like set of stones, some cyclopean in size, now pillowed, and their once neatly fitted joins weathered, though still attesting to how they all fit, or how they all once fit together with the amazing precision of the most ancient megalithic stonework. So let's take a look at that. It's on the next page. So what we're seeing on screen here, it says the Bimini Road and two parallel sections, and it says not to scale. So the Bimini Road, just imagine it as a road that's all cobblestone, but there's two roads that are next to it that have much larger stones set in place. So think of it almost like a tollway or highway. That's Bimini Road. And then more like streets, just regular city streets. That would be the smaller roads, but with the bigger stones. And now it's said here in the book that these stones are now pillowed, which makes me believe that there was some sort of heat event that took place that cooked these stones. And they may not have been stone at the time. We don't know what this material was made of. But the fact that it ballooned, that only happens with high exposure to heat. Let's continue reading here. The reason why the discovery was greeted with relative sensation is also the reason for its greatest misfortune. Back in 1933, Casey had predicted that a part of Poseidia, including a temple and somehow connected with it the vast knowledge of this Atlantean supercivilization, would be discovered near Bimini. In another prophecy in 1940, he said that the Poseidian part of Atlantis would rise again in 1968 or 1969, the very time period in which Dr. Valentine discovered Bimini Road. Adherents to Casey immediately put these separate readings together and proclaimed the Bimini Road a partial fulfillment, and since that day the road's study has remained more the purview of the occult rather than hardened archaeology. Arguments over the Bimini Road do not revolve around its existence, but whether it is a natural formation of beach rock formed by the surf, or whether the natural beach rock was cut locally and then built into a long ceremonial road or boulevard to access some ancient sacred site. Yeah, I highly doubt the oceans just tossed this together. I'm sorry. That's talking about like tornado in a junkyard type of theory. Meaning like the possibility of all of life here existing the way it is, the chance of it being random and not crafted by a creator is the same chance of a tornado running through a junkyard and spitting out brand new automobiles after passing through. That's the likelihood of this just being by chance. And I actually have an entire book covering that concept, which we might read on here one day. Maybe on another show. Let's continue reading here. Enough studies today indicate the latter. Oh, well, that's good. For instance, the general topography reveals the structure is not in line with the coast, and some parallel placements are perpendicular to the coast, nullifying the idea the intricately joined blocks were cut by erosion of the encroaching surf. The main Bimini Road is an inverted J in design. So there's a curve at the bottom that looks like an inverted J. That's the layout of it, if you look at it from overhead. So that if it was a natural beach rock formation, we would have to assume the original one piece of beach rock or reef was unusually shaped to begin with and had oblique and long formations alongside it, but separate to it. Tests of individual and adjacent box, however, have revealed they are pieces of beach rock formed at different times and at different areas of the island. Again, this would indicate each piece was cut and moved to the location to form a man-made structure. Dating, of course, now becomes a problem. The above indicates that Bimini was already basically an island when the formations were built. This unwelcome proposal is refuted by those who wish to link it to Atlantis. They quickly note that the Gigantea and other megalithic island structures were built on high spots and knolls, areas that would become their own islands if the larger island, and Malta in this case, sank. Regardless, if Bimini does date to the early era of our own histories, it would still represent that unknown Atlantean megalithic culture, for lack of a better word than Atlantean. The similarities are striking. 7 huge megaliths form an impressive section in one of the parallel lines of roads or fallen walls. Their joins are so exact as to mirror the dazzling cyclopean work of the Maltese structures of 3100 BC. The presence of several polygonal stones with angles and corresponding joins in the adjacent stone roads is particularly reminiscent of Incan walls. And we have another drawing here from the book, which just depicts two different types of stone walls or rock walls. In this slide from the book here, it says Walls of the Hagar Qim, and that's spelled Hagar. It's one word, second word, Qim, Qim, and Gigantia below on Malta. And the walls of the Hagar Qim, they have like a horizontal base stone that's much smaller than the resting wall stones. They're huge megalithic stones on this Hagar Qim one on the top portion. But then there's also horizontal stones making up the rest of the top portion of the wall. And it does look like there's a doorway there. And then the wall from Gigantia, from Malta, has very similar placement with horizontal stones as like a base, and then the gigantic stones placed on top of that with some vertical stones kind of mimicking what the horizontal stones on the base layer is doing. Those are inserted, it looks like incrementally throughout. There's only, there's like 3 of them. There's a capstone on the left side of the wall. It's kind of like in an L shape. It's showing that it's one piece. And then you have other smaller stones on top of that throughout the top portion of the wall. Hey Andreas, good to see you here. We are covering more megalithic structures today. See how this bleeds in from Tuesday's shows? But it's all good. I actually welcome that type of bleed over here. We still have 5 more diagrams from the book to show on screen. We're a little about an hour in here. We don't have many pages left though. It's going to be a pretty decent show here. So let's continue. Civilization in America reflects the same paradox embodied in the migration of the Celts. We have declared that the Amerindians migrated over the Bering land bridge at some ancient time and then continued south to temperate zones. But it is a fact that the first monumental sites, including those with step pyramids, were built in the Andes. This would mean that the first migrant peoples passed up the finest land to start building cities in harsh altitudes in South America. Caral, spelled C-A-R-A-L, in Peru, is in fact the oldest city of the Americas, dating to the time of the Great Pyramids of Egypt around 2500 BC. An odd place, at the very least, for the first city of America to begin, considering the theory of migration from Alaska. And an unbelievably coincidental, far too coincidental, time period for civilization to bud in America. Yeah, almost like there was a one-world super civilization at one point. One impression is unshakable. America's first civilizations mirror the old world's beginning. Cities with step pyramids beginning around 3100 BC in unlikely places, and traces of an older and mysterious culture specializing in Cyclopean stones that largely built on islands and coastlines. The Bimini site is, in a way, the American Malta, only submerged. The wonder the the wonder the Bimini Road instills in those who observe it underwater, and in parentheses, something easy to do since local glass-bottom boats ferry out loads of tourists to see, quote, Atlantis rising, end quote, end parentheses, must pale by comparison to the structure having been seen on land before it was plunged into the surf and the huge Cyclopean boulders pillowed and flattened by the effects of the ocean. A suggestion that this was beheld on land in relatively recent times, and indeed marveled at, comes from the artwork on the Piri Reis map, one of the earliest maps showing the New World. Formerly residing in the Sultan's palace at Topkapi, Constantinople, it was discovered from the writing on it that it dated to 1513 AD. Along the distortion of the American coastlines, typical of early maps, a large island can be seen. Its importance is noted by its disproportionate size to the coast, and it even dwarfs Hispaniola, or modern Haiti/Dominican Republic. Hispaniola. So I'll just spell that out too. Hispaniola. Hispaniola. Whether this can be taken as a much larger Bahama island because the Great Bahama Bank was not yet submerged as it is to its present extent, the large island is marked by a noteworthy feature, considered, in the art of photography to distinguish it as unique to the area. This feature is a row of Cyclopean polygonal stones neatly fitted together. And if it does not represent the Bimini Road, it must represent other edifices on the Great Bahama Bank of similar design, though now equally submerged and no longer visible. We have another overhead map from the book here. The subtitle underneath this map says, a tracing of the relevant part of the Piri Reis map with the large island at top. The inset shows the island more clearly marked with two stone structures, a road, and perhaps ruins of a temple, arch, or pyramid. Okay. So we're looking at a map here that has South America on the bottom portion of it. We have the Caribbean Sea, Hispaniola, or Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Then we have a bunch of islands just spaced out above that. And then we have a larger island even further north of that with major stones in the center of it in a row going top to bottom. with some other stones to the left side of the shore. But this is showing a lot of small islands in this area. And then to the right side is a blown up version of what's at the top of the left side map here. Just so you could see the placement of the large megalithic stones in the middle of the island. And that has a question mark with the word Cuba. So they're wondering if that's actually Cuba there. Alright, let's continue reading. Overflights of the Bahamas after Mason Valentine had discovered the Bimini Road consistently spotted more tracings of what appear to be constructions, megalithic sites, perhaps even henges and cities. Although the idea that pyramids have been seen remains fanciful, the overall scene is one of a vast urban development. Corings have proven the stone is local beach rock, meaning that, like with the megalithic sites on Malta, the society did not transport material from long distances, but came to the area already possessing their skills. More than being a megalithic site, the Bimini Road may be a part of a greater urban complex. If the latter, then there could be many more artifacts underwater, perhaps even a vast network of cities buried beneath the shallow banks currently swept bottom sands. Yeah, beneath the shallow banks, current swept bottom sands. While the idea that pyramids and more complex dwellings on the Bahama banks or at the bottom of what seems the unnaturally formed tongue of the ocean strikes one as sensational, proof of their existence might be a chance dive away, considering recent discoveries off Cuba. The existence of a complex sunken city off the coast of Cuba gained enough recognition from a number of archaeologists that an expedition was funded from a surprising source, the National Geographic. The location of this sunken city at the very western tip of Cuba is especially intriguing in light of Mayan legends of a cataclysmic destruction of a city to the east, to the city of a city to the east. To traditional archaeology, this could indicate the sunken city was a Mayan colony, but the discoverer herself, Paulina Zalitsky, last name is spelled Zelitsky, initially endorsed a prehistoric date for the city, inspiring those who seek Atlantis to believe they have found the first largely intact stepping stone to their quest. Sonar tracings of formations on the bottom so strongly suggest the symmetrical layout of an Amerindian city that it was possible to believe they were artificial. At the same time, however, their depth of 2,200 feet would place the city's construction back before the melting of the last ice age 12,000 years ago. Coincidentally, the time in which Casey said the last remnants of Atlantis sank in the same general area of the Bahamas. Believers in Atlantis note that the first appearance of Mayan culture was in Yucatan, the closest landfall to the west from the tip of Cuba. And perhaps this sunken city is a remnant of Casey's fabled Atlantis, and the Mayans were colonists or survivors. On the other hand, Orthodox Mesoamerican scholars note that Mayan culture arises in the Yucatan relatively late in history, within the last 2.5 millennia, not a time commensurate with 12,000 years ago. For believers in Casey's Atlantis, this does not matter. The process of moving from the Great Bahama Bank to Yucatan may have been a slow one, with Cuba used as a stepping stone. The city could have plunged much later, and the rest of the culture on the island was decimated by earthquakes. The sunken city could remain a crucial link to Atlantis. In this context, it is interesting to note that Cuba does not appear on the Piri Reis map, unless it and not a Bahama island is the large island marked by polygonal stones. This would indicate there were great ruins found on Cuba which have since vanished. Of all the Mesoamerican civilizations, the Maya were distinct, being the only culture to fully develop a hieroglyphic script. To believers in Atlantis, this indicates they were the closest of all the cultures to the original Atlantean super society. Specifically, as it relates to the sunken city off Cuba, the controversy involving prehistory would be removed if it could be proved that the city had plunged, and therefore is no reason to suggest a prehistoric date commensurate with the melting of the last glaciation. Seismic plunging could have happened at any time, and this would make the existence of the city a little more palatable to the current mindset we have about the past history of mankind, though it would add quite a dynamic to Mesoamerican studies. Zalitsky herself has endorsed plunging, first in May 2001, causing confusion as to why she adheres to a prehistoric date for the site. She has observed, and here's her observation, an excerpt. The area has been seismically active for thousands of years, and what we find on the ocean bottom are fractures from which the magma and volcanic ash came out. From these structures, we were able to delineate a configuration of the land that sank because you can see them clearly. The land that sank is very obvious from our image of the ocean bottom, and you could see bays like harbors, and it's all at the depths of 900 and 700 meters. So we have our next drawing here from the book. The subheading reads, based on various sonar scans and artistic renderings, this is what the sunken site looks like. Zalitsky has described the structures as sitting on a huge plateau, presenting the clear images of, quote, an urban development partly covered by sand. The shapes resemble pyramids, roads, and buildings, end quote. Yeah, it sure does. So this etching here, it's showing about, I want to say, 3 different pyramids in the center, with the center pyramid having almost like cut off layers as it gets wider. So it's like shelved. It's like a shelved pyramid. And to the left of that, it does look like we have a building of some sort, 3 walls, one side open. Then we also have another stone above that, next to the left of the largest pyramid. And then on the right side, to the right of the pyramids, it does look like there's an adjoining structure. Could be a building, could be a road, I don't know. And then there's square structures after that in a line, but they're not all symmetrical. And to the right of those square structures, there's like a barrier wall. At least that's what it looks like. Could be a road, but there's shadowing that makes it look like it's a wall of some sort. And then below all that, after that barrier wall ends, there's another section that looks like a building of some sort. Not too sure what it all means, though. So back to the book. Samples of rock taken by Zalitsky's undersea robot were given to Havana's Dr. Manuel Iturralde Venente for testing. And this doctor's last name is spelled Iturralde -Vient. When the results were finally returned, Zalitsky declared, quote, "Samples that we discovered from the ocean bottom have justified our structures that we call megalithic structures. The samples are granite stone, completely polished, with some incrustations of fossils. Fossils of organic creatures that normally live on the surface, not on the ocean bottom. This is very interesting because this is evidence that the whole surface sank to the depth of 2,297 feet, or about half a mile down." End quote. As if the existence of 20 square kilometers of a sunken city is not controversial enough, the existence of the granite conveys a high degree of trade, as granite is not native to Cuba or Yucatan. Because it is smooth, it also reflects a high degree of workmanship, both naturally expected in a culture capable of building such an urban society. Nevertheless, more proof has not come in 15 years since the first discovery, despite the potential knowledge that remains to be found. Money has been short, and though National Geographic helped fund some subsequent robotic searches, nothing in the way of clear photography has been produced to help identify the structures, giving rise to the skepticism that there may simply have been too much initial interpretation on Zalitsky's part, despite her dogmatic statements above. Well, it's all. Here's my commentary. It's also National Geographic, so I highly doubt National Geographic is going to give anything to the general public that's going to change the official narrative on our history, unless they get permission to do so. It's almost like you gotta sneak it in, do a viral clip, release it on Twitter or somewhere where it'll get shared thousands of times. Then that bypasses the mainstream media, and then you have new information to reflect upon the history we're given, and then adding this stuff into it to come up with a better explanation of what our origins are. But let's get back to the book here. Even if she hasn't endorsed Atlantis, Zalitsky has nevertheless fanned the flame of the most controversial aspect, dating to prehistory. Or the dating to prehistory. She offered that the area could have plunged 15,000 years ago, unquestionably making this a city representative of a prehistoric civilization of which we have no record. Critics point out that the structures on the readouts, if the interpretation they are a city is accurate, clearly reflect a Mayan city, a layout that is radically different from isolated megalithic sites of the Mediterranean, France, and Britain. The theory of plunging is acceptable, but if so, there is no reason to opt for such a prehistoric site. In truth, it could be that Zalitsky has discovered a great Mayan colony. Peninsula Guana Hakabibis. No, I am not pronouncing that correctly. The peninsula is The peninsula's name is spelled Guanahacabibes. Guanahacabibes. The area of Cuba to which the sunken portion once belonged would not have been far from Yucatan. A colony seems far more reasonable than that the Maya came from Cuba. Else, it is hard to explain why any civilization, even 15,000 years ago, if it had begun in Cuba, did not leave any other massive Cyclopean ruins extant on the lush island. However, if the sunken city was a lone colony, then the lack of finding other ruins on Cuba would make sense, and its submergence therefore must be placed in far more recent history. The stories of this city's destruction would be pointless to the overall narrative of Atlantis, and yet, ironically, it could be that modern Atlantologists have cannibalized it to promote it as evidence of a shared recollection of the destruction of the continent of Atlantis that comes down to us from Plato. Even if the sunken city should be proved, it would not help in fitting the Bimini Road into any civilization of the Americas. Not as an outpost, not as a colony. Its style is megalithic, and it matches the Maltese architecture of colossal polygonal stones. So we have another overhead map drawing here. Subheading reads, "The relationship of the sunken site to the coast of Yucatan." So on the left side here, we have the Yucatan. And then we have a very shallow coast that looks like it's part of that sunken portion of the land. It could be part of the Yucatan if it was above water. So almost like a valley that was flooded. And then above that, just north of that's the Gulf of Mexico. You go to the right, that's the southern tip of Florida with Miami on the coast there. You have the Florida Straits directly below Florida and separating Florida from Cuba. Below Cuba, you have the Caribbean Sea. To the right, to the northeast of Cuba is the Great Bahama Bank and the Andros Islands. Almost makes me believe these were more of like rivers back in the time when we didn't have as much water. Alright, back to reading here. The Mayans would not have built this as an outpost, and their architecture does not reflect any evolution from this style. If the Bimini Road was built by an Amerindian society, it would be hard to fathom why such a tiny island would be deemed relevant to the Amerindian culture so far away, and why such a Cyclopean style was still used. Les Hemingway, the brother of Ernest Hemingway, was an avid boater and publisher of Bimini Out, a boating newsletter in Miami. He was a strong supporter of the idea that a cold freshwater well on East Bimini was a healing well. Oh, so there's a freshwater well right in the middle of the shores of that whole Bimini region. You know how we've covered before, it's very shallow. There's fresh water out there. Therapeutic cures had been reported by many people who had ventured through the shallow estuary of its flow, about 300 yards, and found the smoothly drilled well in the island's limestone. Skin cancers and other growths have disappeared from bathers who have soaked at least 3 times in the subterranean fountain. Hemingway has soaked there himself, noting the calming effect. Flanking the estuary are 2 mounds etched in the sandstone. The meanings of their shapes are hard to interpret, but on nearby East Bimini, 3 more mounds exist. 3 more mounds exist, one with the clear definition of a shark. Another is likened to a whale, and a third looks like a cat or seahorse. Like the vivid images on Peru's Nazca Plain, they are designed to be seen only from the air. The existence of these mounds, especially those flanking the healing well, indicates a very early holy site for the gods, or for offering to the gods, possibly because of the healing nature of the water in the well. Tests have confirmed unusually high lithium content to the water, a mineral which is known to cause calmness in humans, and is even a prescribed anti-anxiety drug. If the mounds and style of architecture of the Bimini Road can place the Bimini culture to the era of the Inca or Maya, the very fact Amerindian cultures knew of it indicates they had more exploratory journeys through the Gulf and Atlantic than was first thought, and explored the islands in detail, else they could not have found the well to begin with, in order to appreciate its unusual benefits. So we have another drawing here. This is actually from another place. So this is a stone glyph. So the subheading says stone glyph variously credited as from Coba, that's spelled C-O-B-A, in the Yucatan, or Copan in Honduras, Copan spelled C-O-P-A-N, showing a Mayan fleeing a city tumbling into the sea by exploding volcanoes. And it does look like it's a Mayan with headdress on, all the regalia, they have a whole bunch of wristbands. They're in a boat with a paddle. They're paddling through, I assume is the sea that's there. You have a fish in the foreground. Looks like you got an octopus as well. But then in the background, there is a volcano, and you can see that it's erupting. It has swirls of volcanic ash. And then to the left of that, looks like blocks that are teetering and falling over. Almost looks like one of them's a stairway, but there's blocks that are on an angle that look like they're falling into the ocean. So there's that. Alright, continuing on, and we're almost to the end of today's show. So I also want to thank you again for being here. Please remember to drop a like below and share this to anyone you think would be interested in hearing more about this. Alright, so let's continue reading. One discovery on Bimini. Or Bimini. I keep trying to get it right. I'm pretty sure it's Bimini. But correct me if I'm wrong. One discovery on Bimini, though often used to support the Atlantean theory, actually better supports the theory the Bimini Road was made in much more recent history. The beach rock of which it was made was indeed quarried locally, an indication that Bimini was already an island and not just a low hillock on the Great Bahama Bank when it was a huge island in prehistory. This may not make it prehistoric or Atlantean, but like the Maltese and other megalithic sites, it nevertheless remains mysterious. It could date to the beginning of history, around 3100 BC, and therefore represents a fragment of that early, ambitious civilization of which we know so little. Despite orthodox dating of Amerindian civilizations, probing into their past reveals the same paradox discovered in Old World civilizations. The further back one goes, the more ambition one encounters that must have been lost by the subsequent civilizations. Blocks at Ollantaytambo weigh over 100 tons, with 6 of them oppressed to each other. With such precision, it is hard to conceive how each side was made flush before any kind of fitting was attempted. And so this site is called the... It's spelled Ollantaytambo. Kind of want to take a look at that one too. Let's take a quick look at that. So it's set in the middle of a mountain, kind of like Peru. Oh, wait, is this Peru? It's a town and an Inca archaeological site in Peru. Yeah, it is Peru. Wow, look at that. So it's easy to say, there's not just one city that's in the Peruvian mountains. There's multiple that are like this. Not just Machu Picchu. I look at there's like giant stuff. This looks like something out of Super Mario Brothers. Gigantic stairs. The people look like... I don't know what you would compare this to. You know those tiny Star Wars action figures, like 3 3/4 inch? That's how big the people look compared to these stairs if the stairs were human-sized. These people look like this big on the stairs. Like they're not even standing halfway to the top of it. They're like only a third of the height of the actual stair. That's how tall these stairs are. Or, you know, these could have been farming levels, because there is a staircase on the side for people. But was that added after the fact? Who knows? All right, let's continue reading here. And I'll leave this up until we get to the next page, which we have another map to look at. Stones of the various courses of the fort at Saskatchewan Tower, 12 feet high, and are intricately cut and joined with adjacent blocks, some that have over a dozen sharp angles, and yet all these smaller stones are sealed to them by a hairline of beveled joins. Oh, I said Saskatchewan. It's not Saskatchewan. I'm sorry. Stones of the various courses of the fort at Saskatchewan Tower, 12 feet high. So that's spelled Saskashuaman. And let's take a quick look at that as well while we're here. This is also in Peru. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we just have giant blocks here that are all perfectly fit within each other, but they're not all symmetrical. They're all cut in different types of angles. Like, they make up blocks, technically. But you have parts of blocks that are, like, cut down and, like, rounded. And then you have stones sitting in those impressions like they were all fitted together perfectly like Legos. And then the ballooning or pillowing that they talk about, that's another thing with the heat event, whatever happened with that. That's to say now that these, what we're looking at, the pillowed stones, they were flat at one point. But the precision of these is something else. Alright, let's continue reading here. The Gate of the Sun at Tiahuanaco is carved from a single block of stone weighing 10 tons, while other standing stones in various temple complexes weigh 100 tons each, such as Pumapunku. All of this put in place in the thin air of 12,500 feet. So again, you have to keep in mind that being up in the mountains doing things, if you're not acclimated to that environment, you will get tired and winded very fast. A lot of these look like quarries to me, though. And here we have the Gate of the Sun, which looks like it was originally... it really looks like it was one piece. Yeah, there's little projections out of the stones and some of it, like nodules. Almost like a rock wall if you were to like climb a manufactured rock wall. But this was definitely something that was part of a larger complex. I think that's pretty apparent. Okay. saw that one already. Okay. We're almost finished with this chapter here. We got about 2 pages to go. Traditionally, the dating of the beginning of the Tiahuanaco is over 2,000 years after the first civilizations in Sumeria, and nowhere near to prehistory. It could be, therefore, that the first civilized men anywhere in the world naturally preferred colossal stone, leaving them natural for lack of engineering skills to hew them into perfect squares. Instead, they hauled huge natural stones, left them in their raw state, and only chiseled them enough to get them to join together. Thus, the existence of similar monuments over the world, utilizing this same general architecture, does not reflect the existence of a single prehistoric civilization, but the natural course of progress in handling and using stone for buildings. This would also explain the startling similarity in the most ancient Egyptian stonework, as seen in temples and walls at Khafre's pyramid complex circa 2500 BC, and Tiahuanaco over 2,000 years later. So we do have another overhead map in the book here. This is Bimini, and the subheading says part of North and all of East Bimini. Aside from the 3 mounds, the lithium well is also flanked by curious mounds. So we're seeing an island that has a whole bunch of in-cuts and crevices. So like there's a lot of water flow around Bimini. We have the East Bimini, which is, it almost looks like it's straight cut, but it's not. But like overall, for the appearance of this thing, it looks pretty straight, but nothing man-made. At least from this perspective. And then to the south of this image, we have the healing well. And they said it's also flanked by curious mounds. So it's almost like it was a marker for that. Like the markers were there for the healing well. Alright, let's continue reading. It takes considerable engineering skill to erect a tall building using small square stones or bricks, compared to organizing megaliths, and then on top of these placing smaller stones and courses to extend the structure upwards. This would translate to Sumeria, representing a higher form of engineering and scientific knowledge over the erectors of the megalithic sites much further west, though clearly the builders of the megaliths spent considerable effort to haul enormous stones, reflecting that curious ambition to build permanent and colossal monuments. Yet it is true that the greatest megalithic sites seem to ring the Atlantic. No matter how one slices it, it seems the sunken city off Cuba and the stones on the sunken Bahama banks remain controversial and potentially capable of rewriting Mesoamerican history, and to the hopeful in Atlantis to begin the writing of prehistory, into which so many civilizations since the beginning, 5,000 years ago, have desired to gaze beyond the legends of a golden age lost to cataclysm. Atlantis, as a legend, survives not just because Plato's Timaeus and Critias dialogues discuss its existence and destruction. It exists and remains vibrant today because we as civilized men have existed only for a short 5,000 years. Well, yeah, again, I'm not so sure about that. It exists because the earliest buildings mankind erected reflects an ambition and a lost art of grandeur. It exists because the greatest megalithic sites seem to move inland from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, eventually into Egypt, and into America at Yucatan, and down along the Andes. And there appears to be one on the Great Bahama Bank that in style appears to be far more ancient than any civilization in America. Whether or not it should turn out that the Bimini Road and the mounds or any other structures thereabouts were built by an Amerindian people to mark a healing site as sacred, the existence of such structures in the Bermuda Triangle remain a curious part of its legend of a lost civilization. We must accept that the Bermuda Triangle is more than its enigma. It is a geographic location, and the alluring topography at its surface is more than matched by the natural wonders and scars at its bottom. Possible man-made edifices have joined themselves to the discussion because of a strange coincidence or by true psychic gift from a clairvoyant who decades before spoke of a make-believe world of a super civilization to vanish in the area. Edgar Cayce gave us only one real prophecy, Bimini, and a very unbelievable context, Atlantis. An Atlantis of novel power sources, which Cayce said operated vehicles in the air and then under the sea long before witnesses reported UFO and USOs in the area doing the same thing. But there is something more certain about the depths of the Bermuda Triangle, one less subject to interpretation than the buried stones, and one far less subject to the devotion of occult believers. No discussion of the triangle and its enigma can leave out its place on this globe, its depths and shallows, and the forces that must have created this unique mixture of sea and sky, visible order, and perhaps invisible chaos. And with that, wraps up Chapter 9. So this was more of a recap of what we've gone over before, but it's approached in a different context. So next week, Thursday, we have Chapter 10 we're going to be covering. A Saga of the Earth's Past. I hope to see you all there. And as far as the rest of the week, I'll see you this Sunday for a special show. It's going to be a little different than Let's Talk About It, but I suggest you all be there if you're interested in that topic. And other than that, we're going to be doing the members only shows soon. So those of you who want to help the channel out, help the channel grow a bit back from this blackout that we're in, it'd be much appreciated if you become a member. But that's going to be it for the week. Next Tuesday is Coral Castle Deep Dive at 6 p.m. Central Time. And next week, Thursday, we will continue this show again at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So, until the next one. Class dismissed.